What if the hammer and sickle still flew over the Kremlin today? The Soviet Union, the world's first communist superstate, a nuclear giant that put the first human in space, that faced down Nazi Germany, that stood toe-to-toe with the United States for nearly half a century, collapsed in just 3 days in December 1991. 15 republics became 15 countries overnight. The red flag came down. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a resignation letter. But did it have to happen that way? Today we're diving into one of history's most fascinating what-ifs. Could the USSR have survived? And if so, what would have needed to change? Before we explore alternate timelines, we need to understand the real one. The Soviet collapse wasn't a single event. It was the result of decades of compounding pressure from several directions at once. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was structurally broken. Central planning had created a system that could build tanks and rockets brilliantly, but couldn't reliably stock a grocery store. Corruption was endemic. The black market was, in many regions, the market. Oil prices crashed in 1986, gutting the main source of hard currency. The USSR was spending roughly 15 to 25% of its GDP on the military, a figure that was simply unsustainable. The Soviet Union wasn't really one country. It was a patchwork of over 100 ethnic groups, many of whom had been absorbed by force. Ukrainians, Georgians, Lithuanians, Azerbaijanis. These weren't Russians who happened to live in different places. They had their own languages, histories, and grievances. For decades, those grievances had been suppressed. By the late 1980s, they were erupting. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he knew the system needed fixing. His twin policies, glasnost and perestroika, were meant to save Soviet socialism, not destroy it. But they had catastrophic, unintended consequences. Opening up the press meant people could suddenly discuss how badly the system had failed them. Loosening political controls allowed nationalist movements to organize. Gorbachev had pulled one thread, and the whole sweater unraveled. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup to reverse Gorbachev's reforms. It failed within 3 days, and in failing, it delegitimized the Central Soviet government entirely. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament. The coup plotters were arrested, and suddenly, the republics saw their moment. One by one, they declared independence. By December 25, 1991, it was over. So the USSR didn't die from one wound. It died from many. And that means there are many points in history where things could have gone differently. Let's rewind to the 1970s, arguably the last real window where the USSR could have fundamentally changed course. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union was flush with petrodollars. The 1973 oil crisis had made the USSR, one of the world's largest oil producers, suddenly very wealthy.
This was the moment to invest in modernization, to diversify the economy, develop consumer industries, reform agriculture. Instead, Brezhnev's government used that windfall to prop up the existing system, expand military spending, and invade Afghanistan in 1979. What if they had made different choices? Imagine a reform-minded leader, a Soviet Deng Xiaoping, who pursues what we might call market Leninism. Keep the Communist Party's political monopoly, keep the security state, but gradually open the economy to market forces, allow private enterprise in consumer goods, invite foreign investment in carefully controlled sectors. China did exactly this after 1978. By 1991, the year the real USSR collapsed, China's GDP was growing at nearly 10% a year. It remained a one-party state. Its Communist Party is still in power today. Could the USSR have done the same? It would have been extraordinarily difficult. The Soviet bureaucracy was deeply resistant to change. Every reform threatened someone's job, someone's power. And the USSR had a far more educated, urbanized population than China in 1978, one with higher expectations and greater capacity for political organization. But it wasn't impossible. A Soviet leadership that used the oil wealth of the 1970s to diversify the economy, develop light industry, and gradually raise living standards might have bought the system another generation of legitimacy. The key insight: the USSR needed to reform before it was in crisis, not during one. Fast forward to 1985. Gorbachev is in power. He knows the system is failing. He has two paths he didn't take, one far more radical, one far more conservative. Either might have worked better than the middle road he chose. What if Gorbachev, or a different general secretary entirely, had chosen to delay reform, crack down on dissent, and bet on riding things out? The Soviet system had survived bad harvests, purges, a world war, and periodic economic crises before. With the security apparatus still intact, with no free press, with the KGB monitoring dissent, it's plausible the USSR could have limped into the 1990s and beyond. But the oil price collapse of 1986 was a genuine catastrophe. Without hard currency, the USSR couldn't import food or technology. A hardline government might have faced actual starvation scenarios in some regions by the early 1990s. Repression costs money too. This path probably just delays collapse rather than preventing it. The more interesting alternate history: what if Gorbachev had been bolder and faster? His great mistake, many historians argue, was trying to reform the party from within while also liberalizing politics. He gave people freedom of speech before he gave them economic improvement. He released the pressure valve before he'd fixed the boiler. In this alternate timeline, Gorbachev pushes through rapid economic liberalization first: price reforms, private enterprise, foreign investment, before opening up the press and political system. He also proactively negotiates a genuine new union treaty, offering the republics real autonomy in exchange for staying within a confederal structure. This is essentially what Gorbachev was actually attempting in the summer of 1991. The coup was launched specifically to stop that new union treaty from being signed. In our alternate history, he gets there 2 or 3 years earlier, before the nationalist movements have fully mobilized, before the economy has deteriorated to the point of crisis. Would it have worked? Perhaps. A looser Soviet Confederation, call it the Union of Sovereign States, with genuine economic reform and genuine autonomy for the republics, might have held together. Not as the USSR we knew, but as something. Here's where most USSR survives scenarios run into their deepest problem. Economics can be reformed, political systems can be restructured, but the nationalities question, the fact that millions of people in Ukraine, the Baltic states, Georgia, Armenia, and elsewhere simply did not want to be part of the Soviet Union, that's far harder to engineer around. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been independent nations before Soviet annexation in 1940. Their incorporation was never recognized by the United States. By 1990, all three had declared independence. Short of mass military repression, which Gorbachev was unwilling to authorize, and which would have caused an international crisis, there may have been no way to keep them. Ukraine is the critical case. With 52 million people and the industrial heartland of the USSR, Ukrainian independence was genuinely fatal to any successor state's viability. In the December 1991 independence referendum, over 90% of Ukrainians voted to leave, including majorities in every single region, including the heavily Russian-speaking East. For the USSR to survive in any meaningful form, it needed Ukraine. For Ukraine to stay, Ukrainians needed to feel that staying was in their interest, economically, politically, culturally. In our most optimistic alternate timeline, a genuinely reformed Soviet Confederation, one that scraps forced Russification, protects minority languages, allows real economic autonomy, and offers a meaningful say in governance, might have been attractive enough that Ukraine votes to stay in a looser union. It's a stretch, but history turns on stretches. Let's say one of these alternate paths succeeds. The USSR doesn't collapse in 1991. What does the world look like? The most likely surviving form isn't the USSR as it existed, rigid, centralized, ideologically frozen. It's something more like what Gorbachev was actually groping toward, a union of sovereign states, loosely confederal, with a shared military and currency, but genuine autonomy for member republics. Economically, it probably looks something like Russia today, a petrostate, heavily dependent on energy exports, with a mixed economy, significant corruption,
and an authoritarian political culture, except perhaps more prosperous, because it avoided the catastrophic economic collapse of the 1990s that killed millions of people through poverty, alcoholism, and despair. Geopolitically, a surviving USSR changes everything. NATO probably doesn't expand eastward. The wars in Yugoslavia might play out differently, with a powerful USSR backing Serbia more assertively. The Middle East, where Soviet influence was significant, looks different. China's rise might be more contested, with a Soviet counterweight in Central Asia. And nuclear weapons, those 27,000 warheads that suddenly became distributed across multiple unstable new states in our timeline, would remain under unified command. Many analysts argue this alone would have made the world significantly safer. So, could the USSR have survived? The honest answer is, probably not in the form it existed. The system had too many structural failures, too many suppressed grievances, too much institutional resistance to the kind of radical reform that survival would have required. But a successor state, a looser union, genuinely reformed, that preserved some of what the Soviet space had in common while letting go of the empire's worst features. That's a more plausible alternate history. It would have required better leaders, better timing, and a great deal of luck. What's certain is that the collapse of the USSR was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. History is always like that. The past that happened is just one of the many pasts that could have happened. And that's what makes alternative history so endlessly fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. We've got more deep dives into history's great turning points coming up. And let me know in the comments, which alternate timeline do you find most plausible? Could the USSR have survived? I'll see you in the next one.